Good evening, and for all our great supporters and donors, you'll be pleased to know that because of the popularity of such events and the fact that we've been having to have so many other breakout halls and so on, we will soon be having a hall at our new library, which will be 3 times or 4 times larger. Mr. W de Klerk, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and former president of South Africa. Mr. Yongpeng Hao, SMU Chancellor. Professor Arnold de Meyer, SMU President. Distinguished guests, SMU faculty, staff, and students. History is often made by having the right person in the right place at the right time. And that was exactly the case in South Africa when in 1989, almost some 25 years ago, Mr. Frederik Willem de Klerk became president of the nation at a time when the tide was turning against the apartheid regime of racial segregation, oppression, and disenfranchisement. But the regime, even in its death throes, could have lasted many, many more years, perhaps even decades. By choosing definitively to be on the right side of history, Mr. de Klerk's personal leadership tipped the balance at one of history's inflection points. Born in 1936 to an established political family, his father was both a senator and then a minister in the apartheid government, there was little to reason to expect revolutionary change from the young law student who graduated in 1958. For the next 15 years, he quietly practiced law in the Transvaal, a stronghold of the Dutch Boer immigrants. In 1972, Mr. de Klerk had to choose between becoming either a law professor or a politician. I suppose the family calling won, and at the age of 36, he was elected to Parliament as a member of the ruling National Party. Mr. de Klerk rose quickly within the government, progressing through almost 10 ministries. And 14 years after entering Parliament, he became leader of the House of Assembly in 1986. Moving to consolidate his power, not only in Parliament, but within the party, Mr. de Klerk in 1989 was elected leader of his own national party, and soon afterwards was elected state president. He came to head the, and forgive me for my poor pronunciation, he came to head the Verlichte, or enlightened faction of his party, and worked towards radical constitutional reform in collaboration with the jailed and charismatic leader Nelson Mandela, a policy which carried considerable political and even personal risks for them both. During Mr. de Klerk's tenure, the long-standing ban on the African National Congress Party, or ANC, was lifted. Its leader, Nelson Mandela, was released after 27 years in jail, and South Africa held its first free election based on one person, one vote in 1984, in which Nelson Mandela was elected to succeed Mr. de Klerk as president. As the leader of his party and his country, and beholden to his roots and his own community, perhaps Mr. de Klerk should have been the strongest advocate and defender of apartheid. But instead, he repudiated the National Party's core principles of apartheid and effectively destroyed the social system, which in fact had ironically enabled him to become one of its top elites. Mr. de Klerk's decision to facilitate an end to apartheid was undeniably the right decision morally, and with his brave and skillful leadership, it proved to be the right decision politically and socially. What seemed likely to perhaps become a revolutionary bloodbath became a relatively smooth and seamless transition to a multi-party democracy. And in recognition of Mr. de Klerk's and Nelson Mandela's collaborative efforts to end apartheid, they were awarded joint winners of the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize. Mr. de Klerk, in year 2000, in January, went on to publish his autobiography, The Last Trek, A New Beginning. And he also established the W de Klerk Foundation. He currently travels around the world delivering numerous speeches and sharing his insights as an elder statesman in international conferences on the promotion of harmonious relations in multi-communal societies, the future of Africa and South Africa, and the challenges facing the world. At lunch today, he also gave us a fascinating account of another foundation he's formed, a very quiet one and not much talked about, which comprises previous world leaders, which in fact go to parts of the world which require reconciliation, negotiations, and so on. And he's been doing that very quietly. As he said, diplomacy, discretion is foremost, and do not need to publicize what you have achieved. There are many dilemmas of leadership, all of them requiring personal sacrifice. The giving up of freedom to attain freedom is one of them, and it epitomizes leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. On the other hand, the destruction of an old order by those very elites who have benefited from it the most is another dilemma of leadership. Or the willingness to risk a negative judgment by history in order to be on the right side of history is yet another dilemma. These last two dilemmas summarize the leadership faced by men such as Mr. de Klerk and Mikhail Gorbachev, who in the very same year that Mr. de Klerk started dismantling the prison walls of apartheid, launched a series of reforms which finally brought down the Berlin Wall of Soviet communism. And as we understand it, Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. de Klerk are good friends and keep in touch with each other. Both men, in the height of their powers, started processes which guaranteed their eventual fall from power. But far from falling from the grace of history, both men will always be remembered as enlightened, bold, and resolute leaders who, by their individual acts of courage and personal sacrifice, accelerated change and prevented needless bloodshed in their own societies. Mr. de Klerk's experience gives him a unique perspective on many of the issues that are the causes of concern in the world today, especially in countries where there is still widespread oppression or where such oppression is, in fact, in the midst of being reformed. Events, of course, in a neighboring country in Burma, facing the leadership there, automatically come to mind. And I would be very surprised if there are no questions from the audience about how Burma could learn from Mr. de Klerk's experience and what advice you may wish to give. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Mr. W de Klerk.
Mr. Chairman, let me just put this down. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chancellor, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before I start with my prepared speech, let me thank you on behalf of my wife and myself for a very warm welcome, for this warm introduction, which testifies of serious study about my career. I'm glad that, Mr. Chairman, you used the curriculum vitae, which was drawn by somebody friendly to me and not one drawn by my enemies. It's wonderful to be back in Singapore. My wife and I have happy memories of previous visits. You're a wonderful country with a wonderful system that you've developed, and I'm a great admirer of what has been achieved here. It was also great to get to know what's happening here at the NMU. It's impressive what you are doing. You have a wonderful campus. I had the privilege of meeting with not only the chairman and the president, but also other members of the advisory council and the former president of the country over lunch, and found it most enjoyable. Thank you for warmth and for friendship. I'm going to speak to you, but the questions can deal with any other matter. You're not limited by the contents of my speech, but I'm going to speak to you about the role of leadership in a rapidly changing world. One of the central questions, ladies and gentlemen, that confronts historians is the degree to which individual leaders determine the course of events. Do individuals direct the course of history, or are they themselves simply manifestations of much broader social, economic, and cultural forces? How would 19th century Europe have developed had it not been for the convulsions caused by Napoleon at the beginning of the century? Would there have been a Second World War without Hitler? Would Britain have succeeded in its dogged struggle against Nazism without the Churchill? How would China look today if Deng Xiaoping had not succeeded in grasping the helm in the 80s? Would the broad flow of history have been much the same without these leaders? Or did they fundamentally change the course of history? In my own career, I have had the privilege of interacting with some great leaders who, in their own ways, have changed the histories of their countries or even the world. Mikhail Gorbachev is one of the people whom I count as a friend. The simple reality is that the history of the world, or Europe and of Russia, would have been fundamentally different if a hardline communist had seized the reins of power in the early 1980s. Even though the Soviet Union was doomed to economic failure, an orthodox communist dictator might well have held the empire of the USSR together for decades. The Cold War would not have come to an end. The countries of Eastern Europe would not have been liberated. The Soviet Union would not have disintegrated, and Germany would still be divided between East and West. Often, it's the individual leader who puts his or her weight on one side or other of the political balance who changes the course of history. Ironically, this is not necessarily what Gorbachev intended. In his book, Perestroika, he still declared that communism was the best system, but merely needed to be implemented in a more democratic and open manner. It was never his intention that the Soviet Union should fall to pieces, or that the Warsaw Pact should be disbanded. Ultimately, he found it impossible to control the momentum or the direction of the historic changes that he had unleashed. Nevertheless, the world today would have been a substantially different and, in my opinion, worse place had he not made the decisions that he made. The leader who perhaps impressed me most was former President Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, former Prime Minister. Once again, he was an individual who changed the course of history. In many respects, he was the creator of modern Singapore. Without his leadership, Singapore might still have been just another city in Malaysia. As it is, and despite its tiny size, it has become one of the most successful countries with one of the freest economies in the world. Lee Kuan Yew took the right decisions for his country. He chose the right values and the right economic principles to ensure development of a successful society. In this, he was an artist, painting on the largest canvas that society can provide. I also got to know him as a very astute judge of the world, and he provided, when I met him in South Africa, a very canny and realistic assessment of our situation in South Africa in the early 90s. Another great leader whom I count among my friends is Margaret Thatcher. Few British prime ministers have had such a profound influence on the course of their country's history as she did. She understood, when she became prime minister, what the fundamental challenges were that she would have to address. The most serious of these was a trade union movement and residual socialist policies that were inexorably dragging Britain towards stagnation and national failure. Soon after she became prime minister, she prophesied that within 3 years she would be one of the most unpopular leaders that the country had ever seen. And then, and I quote, she said, "But 2 years after that, I shall be re-elected prime minister with an increased majority." And she was quite right. She took on the unions and won. And subsequently, as we know, she took on the Argentinians and beat them as well. Her free market middle-class conservatism set the paradigm not only for British politics for decades to come, but changed democratic politics everywhere. I remember an exasperated John Major telling me after the Conservatives had lost the 1997 election that he wondered what Tony Blair would do once he had run out of Conservative Party's policies. Margaret Thatcher also had a keen understanding of the unfolding situation in South Africa. Although she was a consistent critic of apartheid, she had no illusions about the nature of the challenges that we faced. She doggedly resisted for as long as she could persistent demands for more sanctions against South Africa in the Commonwealth and in the international community. She realized that sanctions is not such an effective method of bringing about change. That engagement and that economic growth and development are far better change agents than mere sanctions. She always gave me and our partners in the negotiations, the ANC, strong and committed support for the achievement of our goals. And then, although I never met Deng Xiaoping, I believe that he will probably be regarded by future generations as one of the great leaders of the latter part of the 20th century. He himself was a victim of the Cultural Revolution, but nevertheless rebounded in 1978 to initiate the reforms that have fundamentally changed his country. The process that he began has led to the most far-reaching improvement in the lives of the largest number of people in the shortest period in the whole sweep of human history. In so doing, he has visibly improved the daily lives of hundreds of millions of ordinary people and has established China as a leading strategic and economic power. Such is the great canvas of statesmanship. Deng succeeded in turning China from what most people would call a drab and paranoid, ideologically obsessed backwater to a confident, prosperous, and successful society. And in our own country, I would like to mention Nelson Mandela. He's a principled man and a great communicator. Through his natural charm and consideration, he played an indispensable role in promoting reconciliation and in laying the foundations of our new non-racial nation. However, he was by no means a saint. We were political opponents, and he was a tough and relentless negotiator. However, whenever the situation required it, he was able to rise above the political passions of the moment and join me in hammering out reasonable compromises that enabled the process to continue. He also had the stature and the strength to hold these fractious alliances together, even at the most difficult junctures. Ladies and gentlemen, from the perspective that I have gained during the subsequent years, I've been able to identify the following requirements for leadership of major change processes. And these lessons that I will highlight for you that we have learned from our process are applicable not only to countries and to governments. It's applicable to business leaders and companies. It's applicable to universities and to other important organizations. The first requirement of leadership, and to really being able to make a difference, is actually to become a leader. The world is full of brilliant people who have all the right solutions to the problems of the world. However, if they don't have the ability to turn their ideas into reality, they remain spectators and armchair commentators in the great game of life. First requirement, become a leader. The next requirement of leadership is an impartial and dispassionate assessment of reality and of the facts. And I will use South Africa from here onwards as an example illustrating the point I make. At the beginning of the 80s in South Africa, it was becoming increasingly clear to many of us in leadership positions in the then ruling National Party that we were on the wrong course. South Africa was becoming more and more isolated from the international community with each year that passed. The great majority of black South Africans were understandably increasingly adamant in their rejection of our policies and the solutions that we were trying to sell to them. As a result, we had become involved in a downward spiral of resistance and repression that threatened at some stage in the not too distant future to erupt into full-scale conflict. All of this was having an increasingly damaging effect on our economy and was threatening to shut down the engine of economic growth that was and remains our best hope of bringing all our people a better life. My colleagues and I in the government spent a great deal of time from before I became president, from the early 80s, from the late 70s, a great deal of time identifying our problems and wrestling with the need for fundamental change. In open and often brutally frank discussions, we examined the hard and unpalatable facts that confronted us. Our greatest challenge in managing the transformation process was to acknowledge these realities, to admit our failure to bring justice to all South Africans, to admit to ourselves that where we were and the policies we were upholding were morally undefensible, that we were on the wrong course, that apartheid was wrong in itself, and to confront our fears for radical change. By the time I became president, I was convinced of all this. And I had clarity in my mind about the need for fundamental change. Fundamental change which would result in a new system which would bring justice to all the people of South Africa. The next requirement of leadership, ladies and gentlemen, is to accept the need for real change. knowing and admitting that you are on the wrong course, and being able to do anything about it are two quite distinct issues. The prospect of imminent disaster, if we look at history, has not always persuaded those at the helm to alter course. History contains a woeful tally of leaders who have resolutely steered their countries or their companies into war and into bankruptcy, despite the direst warnings of dangers ahead. Others, just as often, have through indecision and inaction allowed their countries or their companies to drift rudderless onto the rocks. Resistance to change, ladies and gentlemen, is deeply ingrained in all of us. All of us, the natural thing is you're comfortable with where you are, with the known dangers and your established reaction to whatever happens around you. In our case in South Africa, my people, the whites and other minorities, had some well-grounded reasons to fear change. We were deeply concerned about the communist influence in the ANC, which at that stage was the most important revolutionary movement. That communist influence included an expansionist policy in the USSR to gain direct or indirect control over the whole of Southern Africa with all its resources and with its strategic position. It was not just a question of communists, reds under beds. There was a real strategy from the USSR to gain direct or indirect control over the whole of Southern Africa. We were deeply concerned when we looked north in the 60s and 70s about the failure of other African countries to build stable, democratic, and prosperous societies. There were the Idi Amins and others. There were the implosion of many economies of other African countries, which gave reason for concern. And we were deeply concerned about the future of ethnic and cultural minorities under a majority rule government, about how, in a typical Westminster democracy, how would the management of diversity be performed? Another lesson we learned was that leaders must avoid the temptation of pretending to change. Very often countries, companies, and individuals who know they must change pretend to change. They bluff themselves. They think of brilliant new ways of doing the wrong thing better. Smokers, and until 7 years ago I was one myself, will tell themselves that if they cut down the number of cigarettes they smoke, they will be addressing their problem. Others who are overweight will fool themselves that by taking no sugar in their tea, they are really coming to grips with their weight problem. For years, we white South Africans also fooled ourselves that we could reform apartheid and thereby avoid the traumatic decisions and risks that real change always involves. It was only when we accepted that we would have to take extremely uncomfortable decisions and risks that real change could begin. Another challenge for leadership within whatever discipline is the articulation of a clear and achievable vision. It is an essential task of leadership. It was my privilege on the 2nd of February 1990 to present a new vision to the South African Parliament of a peaceful and democratic solution to our problems. I said, and I quote, that our goal was a new South Africa, a totally changed South Africa, a South Africa which has rid itself of past antagonisms, a South Africa free of domination in whatever form, a South Africa within which the democratic forces, all reasonable people, align themselves behind mutually acceptable goals and against radicalism. By 1994, to the astonishment of the world, we had turned our vision into reality. A vision, ladies and gentlemen, gives direction and purpose to our actions and provides a way of measuring one's progress. Without a vision, we have no idea of where we are going or how far we have come. Primary task of leadership is the formulation and communication of a vision, but then also to convince people to embrace that vision. And therefore, the next lesson we've learned is that leadership requires special communication skills. We live in a world of perceptions, and perceptions are created as much by how we communicate as by what we do. For us in South Africa, it was very important to convince the media, to convince the international community of our vision and of our integrity when it comes to the commitment of that vision. It was also essential to encourage our own supporters and to reassure them that change was necessary, that we were on the right path, that they had to support fundamental and far-reaching change. Most people can deal with change and are even prepared to make painful sacrifices, but they cannot deal with uncertainty. We learned that leaders must get their timing right. The chairman also spoke about that in welcoming me. Even when you have become a leader, it is foolish to be vociferously right at the wrong time, or to move so far ahead in the right direction that your followers can no longer hear or see you. History and events, ladies and gentlemen, move at their own pace, sometimes agonizingly slowly, and at other times with frightening speed. A leader intent on managing change must watch the tides and the currents and must position him or herself accordingly. More than this, however, he or she must be ready to ride the wave of history when it breaks. After my inauguration in September 1989, the great historic events that were occurring in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union created such a wave. The collapse of international communism helped to allay fears of Soviet expansionism and fears of the influence of the South African Communist Party within the African National Congress alliance. And that helped to set the stage for the speech that I made on the 2nd of February 1990, in which I could announce our diametric change of course, including the release of Nelson Mandela and all other political prisoners, including the unbanning of all political parties and movements, and the launching of constitutional negotiations. We also learned that leaders must persevere having taken the decision to embark upon radical change, having formulated a vision, having communicated the vision, the main challenge to leaders is to maintain control of the process and to persevere until they have achieved their objectives. I realized that the decisions that I announced on the 2nd of February 1990 would unleash a chain of events with far-reaching and unpredictable consequences. It was at times rather like paddling a canoe into a long stretch of dangerous rapids. You may start the process and determine the initial direction. However, after that, the canoe is at times seized by enormous and sometimes uncontrollable forces. And all that the canoeist can then do is to maintain his balance, to avoid the rocks, and to steer as best as he can. And if the canoe capsizes, to put it upright again. When you are in the process of implementing your vision, of implementing the changes which that vision encapsulates, it is a time for cool heads and firm and decisive action. We experienced many such crises after we began our transformation process. The boycotts of the process at times by the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. The violence that continued to scourge the country during negotiations. The ANC's campaign of rolling mass action involving strikes and massive demonstrations. The assassination of Chris Hani, the leader of the South African Communist Party. All of these crises almost caused the process to capsize. But in the end, leadership prevailed, not just mine, leadership of Nelson Mandela, leadership of many others in South Africa, and we kept the canoe on course. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, leaders must accept that there is no end to change and must plan for their own departure. As soon as one has achieved one's transformation objectives, as soon as you have made your vision a reality, the process starts all over again. In a world in which change is accelerating, in which change is fundamental and unpredictable, there is no respite or time to rest on one's laurels and say, well, we've done well, now we can sit back and relax. One of the most difficult decisions for any leader is to accept that he or she too will one day be swept away by the unrelenting river of time. The wise leader will know when to leave and when to pass the baton to a new generation. To sum up, our experience in managing the transformation of South Africa has identified the following leadership requirements. Relentless self-examination. Acceptance of the need for real change. The communication of a clear and attainable vision. Willingness to take calculated risks. A sense of timing. The need to persevere. And acceptance that change is a never-ending process. Leadership, I say to all the young students, is a tough business. Whatever you do, you will be subjected to bitter criticism by one faction or the other. Leaders are confronted with the ever-present prospect of failure, of taking the wrong decision, of seeing their careers end in tatters and ignominy. Leadership is not for sissies. But the rewards of success make it all worthwhile. By December 1993, we had achieved all the goals that I had articulated when I started the transformation process. We had adopted a non-racial constitution. We had prepared the way for our first ever universal democratic elections. And after centuries of conflict and division, we had laid the foundations for a new, peaceful, non-racial nation. Ironically, my greatest achievement as a leader may well be viewed by future historians as my willingness to surrender leadership. I did so on the 10th of May 1994, when President Mandela was inaugurated. Few leaders, I can look you in the eye and say, have ever laid down the responsibilities of office with a greater sense of accomplishment than I did on that day. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.